The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today as we continue the 2022 NACOLE webinar series. NACOLE is an organization that strives to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities that seek to make their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities that they serve. As part of that effort, we have developed our webinar series where, for the last 7 years, we have brought you information on the practices of civilian oversight, oversight innovations in the field, and important work being done in the arena of criminal justice reform. I'm particularly honored today to welcome Dr. Cynthia Lum, who has joined us from George Mason University to discuss evidence-based policing. Before I turn things over, however, I'd like to remind all of you that you have entered today's call in listen-only mode. During the session, you will have the ability to type in any questions you might have, and I will then pose as many of those questions as we have time for following the presentation. Although I'd like to remind you that today's meeting is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. With that, I will hand things over now to Jermaine Defoe, a longtime advocate and practitioner of civilian oversight of law enforcement and a key member of the NACOLE's Training, Education, and Standards Committee. Jermaine?
Thanks, Kemi. I just want to welcome you all today to welcome Dr. Cynthia Lum, University Professor of Criminology of Law and Society and Director of George Mason University Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. Dr. Lum is a leading authority on evidence-based policing, an approach that advocates research, evaluation, and scientific processes that they try to seat at the table in law enforcement policymaking and practice. She's studied and written extensively about patrol operations and police crime prevention activities, police technology, investigations and detective work, and evidence-based crime policy. Additionally, she's developed numerous tools and strategies to translate and institutionalize research into everyday law enforcement operations. Professor Lum is an elected fellow of the American Society of Criminology. She's an appointed member of the Committee on Law and Justice for the National Academies of Sciences, and has served on NAS's ad hoc committees on proactive policing and evidence to advance reform in the global security and justice sectors. She's an appointed member of the Council of Criminal Justice's Policing Task Force, a board of director of the National Police Foundation, and has served numerous elected and appointed positions with the American Society of Criminology. She's a founding editor of Translational Criminology magazine, and was the first North American editor of the Oxford Journal Policing, a journal of policy and practice. Dr. Lum is a Fulbright alum, and she's a co-founder director of the International Summer School for Policing Scholarship, developed with Nick Fife at the Scottish Institute of Policing Research, and with partners at Arizona State University. Her recent book with Christopher Koper, Evidence-Based Policing, Translating Research into Practice, received the American Society of Criminology Division of Policing 2020 Outstanding Book Award. Professor Lum and Koper are the editors-in-chief of Criminology and Public Policy, the flagship policy journal of the American Society of Criminology. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lum. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jermaine. Let me just make sure that you can see my screen before you mute.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for attending the webinar. Jermaine, Cameron, thank you so much for inviting me to present today. I really appreciate your time and the time for everybody who's attending to come in and listen on an issue that's something that is of high interest to me, and I think to a number of progressive police agencies today. Jermaine asked me to provide some basics about what is evidence-based policing, and I'll be doing that today. But I also thought I would take this opportunity just to see if there are parallels with those in the civilian oversight community, and also just to hear your feedback perhaps on what are your thoughts about some of my ideas in this area. And perhaps you might find some interesting lessons learned from the evidence-based policing area that might be able to be applied in the civilian oversight realm. So thank you very much again for having me. Okay, let's see if my slides work here. Great, wonderful. I want to start here by just saying that in 1998, Professor Lawrence Sherman, who is over at the University of Cambridge in England, wrote a piece, a very important piece for the National Policing Institute, formerly the National Police Foundation, in their Ideas in American Policing lecture. And he wrote this on evidence-based policing, where he said that police practices should be based on scientific evidence about what works best. And what he was talking about here were two forms of scientific evidence. The first, many of you might be well familiar with, which is research evidence, evidence that often comes from researchers and academics, in this case, with police agencies usually, to develop, and their partners, to develop research knowledge and evaluation on different tactics and strategies of the police or internal workings of the police. But he also talked about a second leg of evidence-based policing, which is this idea of internal information. So the data, the analysis done inside of law enforcement agencies to track both crime trends and also what police officers and supervisors are doing about them, to also track what's going on internally in the agencies. So for example, the use of sick leave or the use of overtime or complaints against the police. And so these two legs form the basis for his vision about evidence-based policing, which is kind of research, evaluation, and scientific knowledge that's generated by academics, and this internal analytic and data tracking information within police agencies. And since 1998, Sherman has really advanced a lot of his writing and thinking around this, where he not only talks about evidence-based policing as an important goal for the police, but as an important goal more broadly in the idea of democratic governance and democratic governance of the police, that science plays an important role in modern democracies more generally. So evidence-based policing is this idea, as Jermaine said in his kind introduction, that research should have a seat at the table of police decision-making, strategizing, and tactics, as opposed to, for example, only relying on things like procedures or experience or clinical knowledge that's generated in the field, that this other piece of important information is very important. The idea of evidence-based policing comes from a similar area in medicine, evidence-based medicine, and that is if we have a treatment or take a medicine or have a surgery, we want to be assured that whatever we're doing or whatever a doctor is doing to us is going to be helpful, and that we also know the risks of those treatments, the potential harms of those treatments, and hopefully that treatment strongly outweighs the potential harms that might come from a pill or treatment that we are taking. At the core of evidence-based policing is this idea that actions that the police are doing should be linked to desired outcomes. And I'm going to get into this idea of desired outcomes in a minute, but desired outcomes that we all have of our police, right? And that this idea that the police, all the different things that the police are doing can actually contribute or lead to those outcomes. One of the main things that the police do is respond to 911 calls for service. They do many other things. I'll get into that in a second, but they primarily respond to calls for service, 911 and 311 calls to the police. I just wanted to show you this, some data from a study that I did of 9 agencies and their calls for service, just to point out that most of the calls for police, the millions and millions of calls for police that they're receiving each year, are not actually for serious violence. They're more often for everyday conflicts or other issues. And this is the bulk of 911 calls, traffic-related things, people calling about general disorders, suspicions. Sometimes it's for a request for service or a follow-up on some other service that the police have given, or for property crimes like theft. Less often burglary, but often destruction of property and those types of things. And let me also add that in these calls for service, the police primarily do not make arrests. The vast majority of calls for service are what are known as assist-only calls, that the police go and they use their discretion and they respond in a wide variety of ways to different problems. And sometimes they might write a report, and much less frequently arrests or citations are given. And by the way, what you're seeing here is just 5 of those 9 agencies from that study and the proportion of the calls that resulted in assist, report, or arrest. The arrest/citation is primarily citations, and those are primarily traffic-related citations. So arrest is relatively infrequent as an activity that the police do. I also want to say that the police not only answer calls for service, they do a wide variety of other activities. I've listed some of them here, but many of you probably know of other things that they're doing. But they patrol, they patrol between calls for service, known as preventative patrol. They carry out investigations and related activities such as searches and things like that. They might engage with the community or schools on a wide variety of activities, some related to engagement, some related to information gathering or sharing. They do proactive enforcement when they're also not answering calls for service. Some of that might be traffic related or field stops. The police sometimes engage in proactive problem solving with partners, usually from the community or from other sectors of government. And they might also be involved in a lot of internal practices, recruitment, retention, things related to the accountability of their agency, supervision. Engagement with civilian oversight might be one of these things that the police are engaged in, probably not as frequently, but it's part of their yearly activities. So the police do a wide variety of things, not just make arrests, and most often not arrest. So I just want to come back to this core issue of evidence-based policing, and just to reiterate that evidence-based policing is really about thinking about how actions are connected to outcomes. That is something that's easily comes off the tongue. How it actually occurs is a little bit harder. It's where the rubber meets the road, as you might think. By the way, let me just say here that an evidence-based approach to civilian oversight would also ask the same questions. Do the things that the civilian oversight organizations do, or NACOLE does it lead to the outcomes, desired outcomes that we seek from civilian oversight? Because it's a very similar type of a question that I would ask from an evidence-based policing standpoint as well. Okay, let's talk about desired outcomes. So we know we have all these things that the police are doing. What are some of the things that they're trying to achieve? And there are many. And let me just list some of them out here. We expect the police to detect, prevent, deter, reduce, respond to crime. We want them to achieve trust and confidence of their citizenry. This is especially important in advanced democracies. We expect the police to achieve both distributive and procedural justice. Again, a mark of advanced modern democracy. They resolve disputes. We hope that they can help keep the peace. The police also have internal goals. They want to maintain good job satisfaction and retention. There's a big challenge today in American policing where they're losing quite a bit of officers and not gaining any new officers to replace them. And many agencies are concerned with maintaining officer wellness and safety. And finally, I think there are some agencies that hope that the things that they're doing can help them maintain a highly functioning and nimble or dynamic organization that is able to change with the times. The challenge, I think, and I hope the wheels start turning with regards to civilian oversight, but the challenge with this slide right here is there's not agreement on desired outcomes. So remember, evidence-based policing focuses on the link between actions and outcomes. Many actions that the police do, many hope for desired outcomes, and on top of that, there might be disagreement about this list as desired outcomes. And when I say disagreement, I'm not just talking about inside of the police, which is a challenge in and of itself. So you have different ranks that might not buy into that the police, for example, are responsible for preventing crime or stopping victimization, for example. They might only believe that the police are responsible for responding to crime after it occurs. Okay? You also have incongruence, as we like to call it in sociology, but that you have also incongruence about how people feel about these desired outcomes in the community. Community members, activists, people concerned about the police might also disagree that these might be the desired outcomes that the police should be involved in. And that includes folks that may be interested in civilian oversight, right? So I'm going to put this aside for a second, these desired outcomes, and we'll come back to it in a minute. But I think it's important to note that the ideal of evidence-based policing is this link between actions and outcomes, but oftentimes there could be disagreement about the desired outcomes, even amongst the police themselves. Okay? So let's get back to evidence-based policing. We'll deal with that particular challenge in a minute. But the core question of evidence-based policing, the million-dollar question, is whether or not the things that the police are doing are in fact evidence-based. You know, what do we know about whether police activities actually lead to particular outcomes? Luckily, there's been a large amount of policing scholarship that has tried to address this particular question, especially related to the police, to law enforcement's public safety functions. In fact, my colleague Chris Coker and I have kind of reduced this body of research, which we talk about in great detail in our book, to 6 principles that we often discuss and work through with the agencies that we're working with. And I want to share them with you today, just to give you a very quick primer on the evidence that underlies evidence-based policing in terms of public safety. Okay. The first thing that the research evidence, the first principle that we now know of from the research evidence in policing and also criminal deterrence is that over-reliance on arrest is not going to reduce crime. Some people like to say, for example, we can't arrest our way out of crime. The investigation of crimes is important. The arrest of individuals who might be involved in serious crimes is important, but it's insufficient in creating public safety per se. And we know this because we now have knowledge that not only says that more arrest does not equal less crime, but clearance rates have been remarkably stable in the United States despite major fluctuations in crime. Arrest alone doesn't necessarily always or successfully deter either those being arrested or those who see other people being arrested. In the case of some, like certain juveniles, arrest might exacerbate the problem. Arrest may also increase their risk of offending in the future. We also know that the indiscriminate use of arrest for minor crimes and disorders, also that has come to be known as zero tolerance policing, is not necessarily linked to reductions in violence. This was an idea that was born from a theory called broken windows. It may also negatively impact police-community relationships. Deterrence is created by increasing the perceived risk of apprehension, and this concept is very different than actually increasing apprehension, which relies on a greater toolkit of prevention than arrest. The second principle from this huge body of research in evidence-based policing is that officers are much more effective when they are proactive and not reactive. And this not only applies to crime problems, but it also applies to internal issues as well. I noticed from some of your work at NACOLE that prevention, proactivity, is one of kind of the guiding principles or an important principle of advanced civilian oversight. And in the very same way, in policing, proactivity is incredibly important to preventing and reducing crime. Proactive policing stresses prevention. It means anticipating crime and disorder and internal problems before they happen, using things like crime analysis and problem solving, community engagement, and collection of information to use anticipatory techniques to prevent that crime before it happens, to not have to arrest, right, by preventing crime. It really de-emphasizes a reactive, rapid response, 911, response approach to policing. The most important time, I argue, is the time in between calls for service, and that's where proactivity lives. Okay. Of course, it depends on how police are being proactive, and I'll get into that next, the next two slides. The third principle of evidence-based approaches is that police can be very effective when they proactively patrol, investigate, and mitigate places where crime opportunities concentrate and not simply react to people. Why do we know this? Because over and over again, we have studies that indicate that crime concentrates and concentrates highly. Most serious crime is actually located in about 3 to 5% of an entire jurisdiction. For those of you who are in suburban or rural jurisdictions, that concentration is even higher. Okay? So it could be in 1% or less than 1% of entire jurisdiction. And that's very interesting because it brings us to a great deal of research that indicates when police focus their efforts on those crime hotspots, they can be effective in reducing and preventing crime. Traditional policing tends to focus on individuals and not places, and it focuses on them in a reactive case-by-case approach. But research is strongly supporting this idea that place-based approaches that focus on opportunity infrastructures for crime problems can be very effective in preventing and reducing crime. I'm sorry I'm going through this. This is like hundreds of studies, all in just 6 principles, but I hope you're getting the gist of it. The fourth principle from the evidence indicates that if we do have to focus on individuals, knowing that place-based approaches can be very effective in preventing and reducing crime, they're much more effective when they are targeted and not when they are random or indiscriminate. Enforcement and prevention approaches that are focused on, for example, high-risk offenders are especially effective when they are multifaceted. That means that they involve a number of different levers. You often hear this term pulling levers. What that means in theory is pulling many different levers, not just one particular lever, to kind of achieve a deterrent effect. That this targeting is based on sound risk assessment and intelligence. And this is the evidence that people often collect around serious offenders that are being targeted by things like ceasefire or pulling levers or notification approaches. And that these approaches that test out using kind of rigorous and highly effective program evaluation approaches to try to better understand this link between actions and outcomes. And evidence-based policing is about aligning activities toward, or public safety activities at least, towards this evidence that we've found from a scientific study. And that's where we hit our biggest challenge with evidence-based policing. The challenge with evidence-based policing is that current policing approaches are sometimes at great odds with this evidence. Current policing approaches, as I mentioned, are arrest-centric, they are reactive, they are procedurally based often. They're not focused on prevention or proactivity. It's so focused on that response to calls for service or making of the arrest for the investigation. Policing is very much people focused, not necessarily place focused or situation focused or opportunity infrastructure focused. It's much more focused on the individual person on a case-by-case basis. There's also high levels of unstructured discretion in policing. And this is very challenging to an evidence-based approach because all those 6 things that I mentioned before require a much more structured and thoughtful approach to tactical approaches or to strategic approaches or even to internal approaches in policing. And finally, there is a great overvaluation, of experience in policing. It is incredibly overvalued and sometimes romanticized in policing, so much so that it can work against any other kind of outside information, including scientific information, which is clearly outsider information. I don't mean to be a downer on a Tuesday, but the story kind of gets worse. And this, I want everyone to start thinking about this when it comes to civilian oversight as well. It's not that the police are trying to actively sabotage science. Many of them want to try to incorporate scientific ideas into their practice. But the current approaches in policing are deeply embedded, and so much so that to undo them, to unembed them, is a challenge for evidence-based policing in and of itself. And if you can imagine, it's embedded everywhere. It's deeply embedded in the overall missions, the expectations that officers have, the beliefs that they have about what the desired outcomes should be. If you all recall, I mentioned that some officers might not believe that preventing crime is even possible, that it's a part of their mandate. Okay? It's embedded in training and general orders deeply and in the academy infrastructure. It's embedded into the traditions, the habits of patrol, investigations, and management. Let me say, as a former police officer myself, this is very familiar to me. You know, the everyday activities of the police are so deeply ingrained in the mind of police officers that it's really hard to undo them or challenge them. Okay? It's embedded in patrol and investigative deployment structures throughout the technologies that are used in policing, in the supervision, management, and leadership infrastructures and styles in policing. And also it's embedded in the incentive structures, like what officers are rewarded for. What are they expected to do? And then what they are rewarded for and promoted about, okay? These things here and the current approach to policing is not aligned with those 6 principles, but they are very much also embedded in these areas. Okay? So having said that, when I talk about evidence-based policing, I think that achieving it requires more than just generating and knowing the research knowledge. It requires a lot more than that. And we talk about this in great deal in our book, but it really requires a few things. It requires translating that knowledge. So taking this large amount of research, distilling it, not just in 6 principles, but distilling it into actual deployment operations, into actual activities and tasks that a police officer is doing, being trained on, being expected to do, etc. It's not just about translating, because you can translate it into these operations, but you also have to create a receptivity towards this. If there's an opposition to a belief that the police are meant to be preventative or that they're meant to dole out distributive justice, right? Then that's a huge challenge with actually following through with those evidence-based approaches. It also is about institutionalizing evidence into systems and operationalizing and implementing that knowledge into practice. Let me just briefly give a few definitions here. I've already done so, but just to reinforce some of this. Translation is how you make this research, knowledge, analysis, and information meaningful to officers, detectives, staff, to community members, to city council members, to leaders, to activists. What does it mean to them? How does it turn into an actual action or activity? Receptivity. It's the willingness of the police to not only be aware of and understand research and also research processes, the process of systematic thinking and analysis, but also to be open to research, to the findings of research, and demand it for their practice. Okay? If they're not open to that, if they believe, for example, no, my experience is more important than this piece of scientific knowledge, and even if my experience is different than this piece of scientific knowledge, I'm going to go with my experience because I'm more receptive to that type of information than I am to this type of information. So receptivity is an important concept in and of itself in evidence-based policing. And finally, institutionalization, the most challenging part, because this is about re-engineering systems in policing, requires just that. It requires recalibrating some of the core systems of policing. And I say this in one slide, but you can imagine the magnitude of recalibrating each one of these systems so that they might be more aligned with what we know from the evidence. And I'm only just talking about public safety evidence. I haven't even got into some of the evidence about other things, right? Which there is not as much of. But just aligning the police to what we know about how they can be more effective in terms of their public safety role, you're going to have to adjust all of these different types of systems. And that surely is a huge feat. Okay, so evidence-based policing is really about the totality of these 5 things, and not simply about what is the research and how can we generate it. How can we generate more science or more knowledge about something? Although that's incredibly important because it serves as the base. Okay, so that is evidence-based policing 101. I teach a whole class on this, so usually that lasts 16 weeks. So I gave it to you all in just a half hour. I hope I did it some justice so that you get a little bit of idea about this concept. I thought I would end just to give you some ideas. Maybe this could open it up some of our discussion about how this might be relevant to civilian oversight. What's the connection? And I see just so many different ideas in this area. And again, this is not my area of expertise. I will leave the deeper thinking about this up to you. But here's just some thoughts that I initially had when I thought about this. First, I think it's really important to note that an evidence-based approach to policing or to corrections or to any other criminal justice activity is a form of accountability, and it's a form of accountability of science. And this goes back to what Larry Sherman was talking about how science is so important to advance democratic governance, right? It builds this idea that science should have a seat at the table in order for us to fulfill our democratic ideals. And I strongly suspect that civilian oversight has a similar kind of notion, right? That governance needs to be accountable to more than just the people delivering that service, which is the police. Okay? And in this case, evidence-based approaches is about accountability to science and to information. The second point that I want to make is that when we think about civilian oversight, oversight requires understanding what officers should do. So there are a variety of activities and also their desired outcomes, right? An evidence-based approach to civilian oversight within an evidence-based policing context would suggest, are they doing things that achieve those outcomes? Well, I think there's a challenge here because accountability to which outcomes is the important question. There could be disagreement, and this might be the case in civilian oversight as well. There might be disagreement about what kinds of outcomes civilian oversight is trying to achieve. And that incongruence in the belief about the mandate of either policing or civilian oversight or both is a challenge, I think, to anybody trying to take on an evidence-based approach. The third point is probably the most obvious point, and I kind of came out with this, came out with a better understanding of this when I was on the policing task force for the Council of Criminal Justice. We were trying to search for evidence in this area, and there's not a lot of evidence-based related to civilian oversight, probably because it's an area that is less of a focus, has been less of a focus of policing and other scholars. But also it's a hard area, it's a tough area to study. But nonetheless, the activities of civilian oversight boards and agencies hasn't really been evaluated to the extent that we know a lot about what types of models might be most effective. There's a lot of case studies, I would say, more than anything else. And also, we have very little systematic knowledge of citizen reaction to policing. This is a very underdeveloped area. The things that we do have is very unsystematic. It's like people's statements in community meetings. It could be groups or activist groups stating something about the police or making claim that a particular community might believe something. Whether or not they believe it or not is unknown, right? So we have very little systematic knowledge. We know a lot about crime and where crime happens and what crime is happening, but we don't know about victims and how they feel about the police response to crime. There's no systematic data connection on that on a regular basis. Some agencies do this, but it's very rare to find this type of analysis or this type of data collection in many jurisdictions. And so civilian oversight, I think, can be thought about through an evidence-based lens in many of these particular areas. I asked Jermaine to give me some information from NACOLE, and he sent over these slides, which were really helpful. And there's another a document that NACOLE wrote for the COPS office for Department of Justice that also reiterates some of these things. And I thought I would end today just by mentioning and showing a few of these slides. Some of you may have already seen these, to just give an example of how evidence-based approaches might be applied to civilian oversight. Here are some common goals of civilian oversight from NACOLE's reports and training. And an evidence-based approach might ask the following questions. What is the congruence of beliefs about these goals? Do all civilian oversight boards and those who are involved in civilian oversight, including the police, do they agree on these beliefs and goals? Do the things that a civilian oversight agency does, do they lead to these outcomes, essentially, is what they are? And how do we know that, right? How do we know that the things that you're doing can actually lead to these outcomes? And there's lots of involved activity in that question alone. So that involves evaluation, that involves testing out and tracking and trying out and experimenting with implementation of different types of models and approaches to civilian oversight. I also found this, which was the 4 common models of oversight that NACOLE discusses. And again, an evidence-based approach would then ask, okay, we have these outcomes, we have some of these models that reflect I would imagine a portfolio. Each of them have a portfolio of activities that try to achieve some of these outcomes, right? And I think an evidence-based approach would ask when and in what context and how are some of these effective? What do each accomplish? What is needed to accomplish each one of these models well, right? And what are some problems and barriers? Just like in policing, there are many problems and barriers that I mentioned. What are some problems and barriers with implementing each of these models and why? To dig a bit deeper, NACOLE has these 13 principles of effective civilian oversight. And when I read through them, they're very much more detailed information about like different models of civilian oversight or different activities of civilian oversight and characteristics of things that NACOLE feels from best practice might be useful for good civilian oversight. And to me, I think really interesting research questions about this are, what do we know about each, either alone or in combination in terms of achieving either those models or the outcomes that civilian oversight is trying to achieve? Which of these are most important and at what stage, right? So there might be some places that are just starting to build civilian oversight, and maybe 3 of these are much more important than others. Whereas somebody who has a very well-established civilian oversight might need to focus on something else, right? So this list is very dynamic when I look at it. And it also raises the question for me, which is a question that we raise all the time in policing. How do we measure every single one of these things? How can I measure if an agency is independent? How can I measure if they're getting full cooperation from an agency? How do I measure if they have adequate funding and resources? I would imagine that's a huge and very important part of civilian oversight. It has to be funded well, it has to be resourced well in order for those boards to do their jobs well, right? And that's a question that requires more analysis as well. So when I think about an evidence base to civilian oversight, I, again, mention what do we know about the different models, the different activities, how do we achieve these different activities effectively and well, right? For the research that does exist, where is it? And what does it mean? How do we translate it? How do we build receptivity to knowledge about civilian oversight, not just within the civilian oversight community, but also within the community at large or within police communities more specifically, right? What does it mean to them? And how can we build receptivity towards that knowledge? Internally, are civilian oversight boards receptive to knowledge about their own practices? And this is where, the rubber meets the road. In policing, it's easy to be idealistic, I think, and progressive about what we hope the police can accomplish. But are the boots on the ground police, are they receptive? And how do we build that receptivity? By the way, winning hearts and minds is like an ideal that doesn't work, nor does training on its own, right? When I talked about institutionalization, building receptivity requires building infrastructure that then is receptive to the information that's being fed into it. If that infrastructure blocks that information, you can win the hearts and minds of everybody or train everybody all day long. But if the system itself is not going to receive that knowledge or isn't capable of receiving that knowledge or adjusting a deployment structure with that knowledge, then training is not going to help. And also, I think we need to think about how does evidence on civilian oversight shape practices of the oversight organization itself? And I think that's a very interesting question that can be looked at from an evidence-based perspective. Finally, I think this is a question the NACOLE is probably very interested in. Civilian oversight organizations probably have a wide variety of capacities, and the one reason why we have national organizations like NACOLE is to be repositories of this type of information, translators, disseminators of this type of information. Because in order, for example, when I work on an individual agency, for that individual agency to be moving towards an evidence-based approach, it needs to be able to look someplace for the information, for guidance, for help on how to translate that information into actual practices or what have you. And so oftentimes, national organizations that can disseminate or be repositories of evidence are so key to an evidence-based approach to anything, let alone evidence-based policing. So I guess those are just more my thoughts than anything else. I'm definitely not saying those are the right thoughts for civilian oversight, but they came to my mind as I was starting to look at some of the material from NACOLE and also just from my own experiences on the policing task force trying to seek out research in this particular area. So I hope you enjoyed that, and happy to take questions. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much for not only the information on evidence-based policing, but also taking the time to really also direct those same thoughts towards how they apply to civilian oversight. I think that our audience will probably find that very helpful, and you've addressed many of the issues that those on the call or webinar today face on a daily basis. So we do have some questions for you.
Okay.
The first one actually is a statement, starts as a statement from one of our attendees about disagreeing with the downplaying of the effectiveness of broken windows-based policing. We have evidence, he states, we have evidence of the benefits of what was in essence an unplanned controlled experiment. In New York City, Bill Bratton introduced a broken windows-based strategy when he was chief of the New York Transit Police. Crime on subways dropped. Crime overall in the city, the control group outside the transit system, stayed high. When Bratton later became commissioner of the NYPD, he took broken windows citywide, and citywide crime then dropped, mirroring the transit system's crime drop a few years earlier. In short, he believes evidence does support the utility of broken windows when broken windows is appropriately implemented. Any comments from you on this?
That's a great question. Oh, okay, can you hear me okay, Cameron?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the question. It's a fantastic one. There's a lot of debate about not only the New York experience, but broken windows. I have to say with pretty good review of this evidence, that the totality of the evidence related to aggressive arrest for minor offenses does not necessarily reduce violence. And that was the original idea from broken windows, from the standpoint not of arrest reducing violence, but the idea of police being involved in minor offenses to reduce violence. I think one thing the person who asked this question pointed out, which I would agree with, is that it's about how this is being implemented. Anthony Braga, a very famous policing scholar, has done a systematic review looking at different approaches to disorder by the police. And the type of broken windows that can be very effective for disorder-based approaches are much more focused on problem solving and trying to get at the underlying issues. So using CPTED, using situational crime prevention, using problem-oriented policing approaches than enforcement approaches. I'll also say that some of the folks who debate this issue and who are much more knowledgeable than I am about it, but would argue that crime was already declining prior to Bratton's implementation of this approach. I've done some work myself on misdemeanor arrest, use of misdemeanor arrest in a study of multiple jurisdictions who've had increases in zero tolerance arrests for minor offenses. And I do not find any relationship between reductions in crime and that policy decision. But I think the more important issue is, well, two important issues that I want to raise about broken windows. One is that we do know that the long-term consequences of that type of approach to policing are not sustainable. In New York in particular, it led to the communities being upset and in some cases rightly so about an approach to policing that was believed to be heavy-handed. And I think it can impact police-community relations in way. This is the harms that can sometimes come from that treatment, as I mentioned, for evidence-based medicine. It can harm police-community relations. We also have evidence that it created a backlog, or front log, into the criminal justice system that could not be sustained by the system either. Increasing in jail populations, increasing in misdemeanor courts, and huge amounts of nolle pros and stat related cases. So I appreciate the question because I think there's a lot of debate over it. And there's certainly a great deal of evidence now that seems to suggest that there are things that can be more effective in reducing crime than that. Thanks for the question, though. Very good one.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer. So our next audience member asked, how do you get the police, civilian oversight, politicians, and the community to align with the same desired outcomes?
Oh,
$1 million question.
I thank you so much for asking this question, because right now I'm particularly concerned about the divisiveness in our society. And I know that's like such a broad statement that may not be related to your question, but I think that underlying the fact that we cannot agree upon all the time what might be the ideals of a modern democratic police force is rooted not just in our debates over what is possible and what the police can do or should do, but it's also rooted in our politics and our beliefs about what democracy is about. And let me just say that I think this is deep. The divisions are deep. When you have police officers who may not, some police officers who may not believe that they can prevent crime, even though we know that they can from the science, that's a huge challenge. I would also encourage all of you to think about a parallel in the medical field. We can't agree on vaccinations, on whether or not smoking should be banned in public places, whether or not kids should be inoculated on measles before they go into kindergarten. I mean, there's so much disagreement about certain goals in the medical field, just as they are in policing. So first part of answer to, let me get to your question now. I think dialogue is incredibly important. For a long time, I think policing was very insulated from the outside. And that insulation really led to a world of policing. And again, I know what this world is. I was in it. It's like a world that is so different than what people might think policing is from watching television or what have you, or seeing something on the news. And it's because it's so hidden and insulated, there's also a mythology that's created around policing. And it's not only created by the police, it's created by people, us, in our beliefs or our expectations about the police. Having that dialogue about what we all believe and come to agreement on about what we expect from our police is probably more important than the agreement itself, because I think that'll raise how different some of us believe the police should be. For example, there are activists who are with great intentions, who are concerned, and rightly so, about police activity today, who argue that the police should only be concerned with crime and responding or reacting to it. And I don't believe this. Why? Because I know that when police only do that, then they cannot do the things they need to do to be able to prevent victimization, okay? And so in order for us to come to some agreement about that, we got to hash it out. We got to argue it out. We've got to have that dialogue and discussion, including discussions and debates between me and the police when we're working with them. And that happens all the time. So I think a lot more dialogue, a lot more discussion, a lot more openness and transparency about what each of us are doing and our intentions. I often encourage police supervisors and leaders to have more conversations like this with their officers, so that they do have a little bit more philosophizing about what the police should be doing in a modern democracy. And I just think that's so important. But I don't think that social media has helped that, frankly. I think it's probably made dialogue and good communication a little worse.
Thank you so much for your response to that question. Our next one is, you briefly mentioned a lack of systematic studies of community perspectives and experiences of policing. Do you have any ideas on how to fill in this gap?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. Love that question. Many different ways. I've been asked on numerous occasions to do random sample community surveys, and we do them, and they're expensive. But I actually don't think that that's the greatest way to gauge citizen response. I think you really have to focus in on people that actually have exchanges with the police. The vast majority, just like crime being concentrated, the vast majority of people never have contact with the police any time during a year, right? And so to ask them what they think about police service to them would not be helpful. So for example, instead of random sample surveys of whole communities, you can do sampling of victims. You can just simply do customer service surveys of victims as they're after something quick after they get service from the police or after a police responds to their call for service. You can do sampling or surveying or similar types of customer service people but who have contact with the police in a negative way, that have been arrested, that have been stopped by the police, that have been given a ticket by the police. Okay. There's also many of my colleagues, in particular, Chris Coper and David Weisford, are involved with interviewing and surveying people inside of hotspots specifically. David Weisford and his colleagues, with the National Policing Institute, just finished a huge study that looked at how people respond to police activity in particular hotspots. And so targeted surveys, but that are done in systematic ways, right? Not that are just done by knocking on someone's door and saying, hey, what do you think? And then taking that as the whole community's view, right? Systematic approaches to targeted surveys, I think, is the way to go in terms of getting at some of that information.
Thank you.
Great question.
Our next question moves more into a practical realm for the application of this, and it's centered around rule drafting. Have you noticed any difference in outcomes from the drafting of police department rules between departments who involve community members in rule creation and departments that don't involve community in rule creation?
What is meant by rule creation? Like procedures for officers?
That is my assumption, and the person who asked the question, if we are assuming wrong, please let us know. But that is, I would assume it's in the drafting of policy and procedure.
Yeah, I have seen this before, especially related to body-worn camera, development of procedures for body-worn cameras, where members of the community or legal groups are involved. I think what's important is bringing the right people to the table that have the knowledge about a particular area. I think, for example, if you are trying to develop better procedures and policies to mitigate disparities in policing that could occur, you really want to bring in members of communities of color in order to think through some of those issues. So having the right people at the table is important. But I think I have seen this done. Whether or not it's effective, that I don't know if I've seen any study that looks at that. But having that important outsider information and knowledge, I think, is a perspective and an approach to procedures that would be helpful. There are other procedures in policing that are more maybe not as important to have a member of the community be involved in. But I would also say that there are not only existing rules, but a lot of evidence-based policing is talking about new ideas, new procedures, new tactics and strategies. And building those things really requires a lot of expertise, I think, that is not just inside of the agency. I hope we interpreted rules correctly there, Cameron.
I have not heard otherwise, so I think we did. The next question, I think we have time for just one more. I apologize to those of you we won't be able to get to today, but this one really goes back to the move towards a space-based approach away from an individual-based approach. And our attendee asks, how do you address a situation when the evidence is contrary to community expectations and desires? For example, evidence will suggest certain hotspots need much more police attention, but the community will see this hotspot focus as over-policing that will lead to more arrests and further incarceration. How would you address this type of issue?
Oh, I think that's a great question. And there's already people who are working on building the evidence in this area too. In policing, the million-dollar question is how? How are they? What are they doing and how in hotspots? Hotspots is just about where, okay? It's not about how or what or when or who. right? And so when police go to hotspots, what they do there matters incredibly. And if you tell officers, go to that hotspot, go, do something at that hotspot, it's a high crime place, right? Without any guidance, they're going to take an approach that they're most used to. And that approach, which they're most used to, is likely pedestrian stops, traffic stops, or arrest-based approaches, okay? Why? Because all the things that I mentioned about place-based approach, about proactivity, about targeting, about crime analysis, about problem solving, about community engagement, right, is not necessarily built into a deployment strategy at those hotspots necessarily, including things like the use of procedural justice, the use of good customer service, and just showing respect. Let me also add that it's not just what they're doing, but what they do before they get there. And that means keeping the community involved with and engaged and knowledgeable about the fact that the police are going to be doing some operation inside of those hotspots, and what is the justification, right? There will be folks and maybe offenders in hotspots that are not happy when the police come to try to reduce crime in those hotspots. And there will be people that will oppose it as well on many different reasonable grounds, ethical, moral, issues of disparity, what have you. Having those discussions and really talking to the community and providing a better dialogue with the community about what the police are going to be doing at those hotspots has been shown to be something that can be useful in creating a deterrent effect at hotspots without creating a negative community backlash. There are at least 2 studies now that show that that do not show that hotspots policing creates the type of negative feedback that oftentimes people are citing to. That backfire effect I have not seen in the 70-some hotspot studies. On the other hand, sometimes it's not measured well either, or not measured at all. So being able to systematically measure how people perceive the police who are coming in and doing hotspots policing is incredibly important for the police to be able to adjust their approach to something more acceptable to the community that lives there. So all of this is hard. Let me just say, none of this is easy. It's easy to say to a cop, go to that hotspot, it needs some attention. It's much harder to mentor that officer into doing the right thing when he or she gets there. But the latter is what evidence-based policing is about, not the former. And that's the challenge.
Thank you so much for that. And I'd like to just close by saying how much we appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share your knowledge, your work, and your perspectives with the civilian oversight community. I think it will be incredibly helpful in the work that we're doing going forward.
It's my pleasure, and thank you all, and best wishes to all of you. I know you all have a challenging job to do as well, and I appreciate you. So thank you, Cameron, for having me, and Jermaine, and I hope everyone has a great week.
Thank you. And with that, I will just close out with a couple of more pieces of information for our audience today. First, though, I must also thank Jermaine for pulling this webinar together for us today. NACOLE really could not do what it does without those who are so willing to share their knowledge with the oversight community and to help us put valuable programming like this together. If you'd like to take advantage of more virtual trainings, the virtual component of the 2022 annual conference begins on October 26th. On that day, NACOLE will bring a full day of sessions exploring those entities who are in various stages of implementing or enhancing civilian oversight of law enforcement. The virtual components will continue on November 2nd and 9th, and to register or obtain more information on all 3 days of programming, please visit NACOLE.org. There you'll be able to register and obtain more information and see information about our speakers. It's been a pleasure being with all of you today, and I look forward to being with you at our next event. Thank you.